Hello, World History Summer School students. I hope you guys are doing well. There we go. For some reason, the program that I use to record these it always wigs out for the first 5 seconds. So sorry if the first 5 seconds are weird. Um, so I'm in my classroom today, and behind me is a map. I don't know how well you can see, but it's a map of Indonesia. I lived in Indonesia for 3 years. That's where I started teaching. So it was a while back. It was about, I think I moved there, yeah, 11 years ago, and um, it is the world's largest Muslim country. In fact, it has more Muslims than any other country, and a big part of that is just because it has a lot of people. A lot of people crowded into the islands of Indonesia. Um, and today we're going to talk about Islam. We're going to talk about the Muslim world. And, I'm not this huge expert on this subject, but, it is, when I think of Muslims, I do think of my neighbors and people that I got to know in the country of Indonesia. Um, so, what we want to do today is dive into kind of what Muslims believe and kind of the history of early Islam. I think I'll probably clarify this later on, but just to do it now, Islam refers to the religion. Talk about what actually that means in a little bit, and then Muslims are those who are followers of the Islamic faith. Okay, so this is chapter 10. We are doing chapter 10 this, I was going to say this week, today, a week of, I'll probably say week sometimes, but, in summer school, a day is a week. So anyway, we are doing chapter 10. Let's move along. Okay, the rise of Islam. Islam started in Arabia. So this thing is called, it says deserts, towns, and travelers. Arabia, and I have some dates here for you in a second, but, we are kind of right around, well, let me back up. Islam is really the last of the major world religions to come around. And Hinduism, it had existed in India for a while. Buddhism had for probably about 1,000 years before Islam, and Jesus Christ was born about 500 years, actually about over 500 years, 600 years before Muhammad. Okay, so Islam comes along later than those, and it comes from this very obscure place. Arabia is a desert region. It is connected to the world by trade routes. People do pass through it, and there's a group of people known as Bedouins who are the ones who kind of they're kind of semi-nomadic people. They often lived in tents, or in kind of oasis towns, and did a lot of traveling, a lot of trading. They had camels, and they moved around the area, bringing things from place to place because most people didn't want to cross through the desert. They knew how, and so they were kind of this relatively small population. And Arabia was, it was obscure. If you think about the time of the Roman Empire, Arabia was kind of the outskirt, area that wasn't really part of it. And the Roman Empire didn't really have anything to do with Arabia, and then would go into, at least they always had some conflicts with the Persian Empire, kind of on the other side of it. And so Arabia is this, the peninsula that was just there. There are two major cities, and really only two cities in Arabia, Mecca and Medina, and these are going to play into Islamic history. So there were two kind of cities, small towns, or maybe not small towns, but small cities or towns, Mecca and Medina, that grew up in this desert region of the world. All right, so here's some pictures of Bedouins who, with their camels, with their kind of homes that are movable. And then this is a picture of a little bit later on, after Islam comes into, a picture of Mecca. Okay, so there we go. We need to move this along. You can't talk about Islam without talking about Muhammad. I want you to know some things about Muhammad. So I have a date for you. I think this date would be good to know. This is when he received what he believed was a revelation from an angel. Muhammad was a merchant. He was one of these people that traveled. He was well off. He was kind of a prominent man. He wasn't necessarily the most, important person early on, but he was a wealthy merchant. He was known for being a kind of a good man as far as the way he treated other people and that kind of thing. Muhammad, went from being, a guy that managed his household and his business affairs and all those kinds of things to really being consumed with questions of kind of spiritual reality. Like, most of the people around him, in Arabia, were these people worshipped idols. They were pagans with a lot of animistic influences, and he felt that this was an empty system. And so he began to pray. He began to meditate. He began to think about these things. He began to go and fast and sort of like, really searching for more. Now, I do want to point this out kind of before we get too far involved in these notes. Arabia was kind of a remote, obscure place, but in the general vicinity, there were Jewish communities, especially up in Babylon, modern-day Iraq. There was a lot of Jews in that area. There were also some Christian communities. Christians had been spread out all throughout the Roman Empire because of persecution, and this was 500 years. So this was, after, good while after the time of Christ, or I guess 600 years. A good time, this was after the fall of the Roman Empire, and so Christians were prominent. It was after the time of Constantine, so Christianity had been legal and for a while in the Roman Empire, and now the Roman Empire has fallen apart. And so it's Muhammad would have known about Christianity and Judaism, and it's clear that he did, because when you start, when Islam starts being preached, they talk about Jesus. I mean, Jesus is in the Quran. Abraham is in the Quran. Moses is in there. This is a religion that really builds off those other ones. So anyway, going back to Muhammad. In 610, he receives a revelation from the angel Gabriel. He is told by the angel to recite. The word Quran, and I want you to know this, the word Quran means to recite. Okay? It is the word for their scriptures. It is basically the Bible of Islam. But specifically, the word means to recite, like word for word, say what I'm telling you to say. And from the beginning, Muslims have this very kind of strong view that what the Quran says, what Muhammad was saying, at first it wasn't written down, but what he was saying to people was the exact word from God through his angel, but this is the exact thing. It wasn't Muhammad's words at all, is the idea behind Islam. It is the exact words from God. Like, as Christians, we believe that the Holy Spirit inspires the Bible, but we also know that the Apostle Paul, what he said was very much what the Apostle Paul wanted to say. And it was guided by the Holy Spirit in his desires to say these things. Muslims believe that what Muhammad recited in the Quran, really, he was just kind of a channel for that. And so it's a different view, and it's because of this, like, they don't translate the Quran. It has to be in Arabic. If you want to be a good Muslim and read the Quran, you learn Arabic, because it's untranslatable, because this is what this is what God said. This is what the angel Gabriel told Muhammad. Hey, this is what Muhammad recited, so you need to learn it in the language that Muhammad did it in. And the key theme was monotheism. All other gods must be abandoned. There should be one God. I don't think I have this in my notes. Let me see. I don't. Okay. I want you to write this down. The term is Allah. You probably have heard it. A-L-L-A-H. Allah. Allah is the word for God in Arabic. Now, let me just make something clear. Christians in the Arabic-speaking world use the word Allah, God, before Muslims did. And they continue to use the word Allah before Muslims. Or not before, but now during the time of Islam. So the word Allah means God. Now, just because it means God does not mean when they say God, they mean the exact same thing that Christians say. I mean, Christians, by definition of being Christian, when you say God, you will say to yourself, how do I know God? Well, I know him through Jesus Christ and how Jesus Christ lived and acted and, the things that he did. So, Muslims say, no, Jesus isn't God. Jesus was just a prophet. So, Allah means God, though. So, some people want to argue about like, oh, they worship Allah, they don't worship God. They mean the same thing. They both mean God, and Christians use the word Allah, and they did before Muslims. But at the same time, Muslims have a very different conception of God. I hope that makes sense or helps. I probably shouldn't show the picture. This is a picture of an angel speaking to Muhammad, and Muslims don't use pictures of Muhammad. They don't want to be accused of idolatry. So I shouldn't have that in the PowerPoint. Anyway, Islam, I want you to write this down as well. Obviously, you're taking notes, but the word Islam means submission. So I want you to understand the term, this is the term that means the Muslim religion, right? And so it involves a lot of things that, what they believe and all the rest. But at its root, the word has to do with submission. And so the way Muslims view God and our relationship to him and their religion and everything is that to be, Muslim is to submit to the authority of God. It is to do what God says. Now, this isn't a bad concept. Christians certainly believe in the submission to the authority of God, but that's a very interesting kind of, I think, understanding of their faith is that it's very much the world and our life and everything should be brought into order, be brought into submission to the will of God. That is really the overarching theme of Islam. We should submit ourselves to what God desires. I mean, I would contrast that with Christianity that, the overarching theme is God's saving of us, God's rescuing of us. There's a difference in the way we kind of, our big story, right? The big story of Islam is to submit to the will of God, and the big story of Christianity is God's action on our behalf, right? What God has done for us. So these are different. Now, submitting to the will of God, it's definitely a concept that's compatible with Christianity, though. So a Muslim is someone who has submitted. So these words are linguistically related. Islam is submission. A Muslim is someone who has submitted, and Quran is to recite. So there you go. 3 Arabic words and what they mean, and I think it does probably help you understand Islam a little bit more. Okay. Okay, so Muhammad went around. We're going to have to take a little time out before we get to this next line here. Muhammad went around and he began preaching, he began reciting the Quran and began telling people, no, all these other gods are idols. We need to get rid of them. There's only one God. We need to do what he says. He wants us to live this way. And he began to destroy idols, begin to talk against them. Now, the people in Mecca kicked him out. And they kicked him out largely because Mecca was sort of the center where people would go to worship false gods and to worship these idols and things like that. And so he was hurting that industry, and so they kicked him out of there. And so at this point, Muhammad had a following. He was already someone who had large caravans that he would travel Arabia with, and so he had gained a lot of people following him. And it was a good number of people. I don't know the number, but it wasn't like it was just Muhammad by himself. He had his whole family. He had followers that believed what he was saying. There were servants and everything else, and they all moved from Mecca to Medina. And this movement is called the Hijra, and it's something that is remembered by all Muslims, of Muhammad's rejection, and also the fact that Medina accepted Muhammad. Muhammad comes to Medina. The people of Medina accept him. Medina basically becomes the first Muslim society. And so, as a whole, Medina submits to the will of Allah. They become Muslim. And really what happens is Muhammad takes charge of Medina. So I want you to see something very clear from the beginning of Islam. Muhammad was both this religious teacher and leader, prophet or whatever, as well as the leader of the society. He was both the pastor and the governor, right? He was both of those things. Or whatever term you want to use for that, and so he is both a political and a religious leader, really from the time of the Hijra when he went to Medina. Okay, does that make sense? I hope so. Finally, after he's able to gain enough kind of influence in Medina and power, political power, the people of Medina, led by Muhammad, go and attack Mecca, conquer Mecca, and also bring Mecca in submission to the will of Allah under Islam, right? And so Mecca, which is Muhammad's hometown, is conquered, and he leads this charge, right? They see this as a righteous thing to do, but that is kind of, so I want you to kind of understand, like, at its core, what's going on in Islam is there's this connection between the political leader and the religious leader. So there's some pretty big differences between what's going on, with Muhammad and what Jesus did and said. Okay, so there you go. There's a little bit about Muhammad. Okay, we're gonna move on. I don't know why we need those pictures. The rise of Islam, we're still in part 1, the rise of Islam, the belief and practices of Islam. We're going to go through the other sections pretty quickly of this chapter, but you guys need to know this. You will need to know the 5 pillars of Islam. It will be on, the quizzes and tests and stuff where we're online or open book, but once we go back to real class, it will... they won't be, and it will be on the final exam for the semester, and so please know it. Okay, the 5 pillars of Islam. Number 1 is the confession of faith. The confession of faith is this: there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Right? So there is only one God, Allah, Muhammad is his prophet. And so that is kind of the key. That right there is really what makes you a Muslim. Confessing that brings you into Islam in a lot of ways. To really, if you really confess that there's only one God, Muhammad is his prophet, everything else stems from that. Because if you only believe in one God, you're going to get rid of your idols. If you believe Muhammad's his prophet, you're going to do what Muhammad taught and submit to the will of God. These things don't all come directly from the Quran. They come from other writings and things written about about Islam, or about Muhammad. But anyway, the call to prayer 5 times a day. Muslims are supposed to pray. If you live in a Muslim country like Indonesia, you will hear the call to prayer on a regular basis. It will wake you up in the morning. It will put you to bed at night, and you will hear this, call for people to come to the mosques and pray. And Muslims are to do that. Now, there are exceptions and things like that, but in general, this is how you're supposed to live as a Muslim. Giving to the poor. You can call alms or charity, but Muslims are supposed to give a percentage of their money. It's a fairly small percent to those that are in need. Okay, so prayer, charity. This is, a lot of ways very similar to Christianity. These are things that Christians believe, at least. Fasting, also something Christians believe. Muslims do it in the month of Ramadan. There is a month where they fast during sunlight hours, and so what they do is they wake up early and they eat, and they don't eat all day. And then at night, they usually get together with their family and have kind of a big feast. And so they actually wind up eating a lot of food during Ramadan. But it is a time of fasting, and during the day, a time of concentrated prayer and devotion to God. Okay, so these are things that Muslims are all expected to do. And the last one is the Hajj. Hajj means pilgrimage, and they're expected to go to Mecca. I mentioned earlier that Mecca had long time been a center of the kind of idolatry and things like that, and so and people coming to Mecca to worship false gods and idols and such, and so Muslims still to this day travel to Mecca to worship at the Kaaba, which is like the center of Islamic worship. And all Muslims are supposed to pray toward Mecca, and all Muslims are supposed to travel at one point in their life. They're supposed to travel to Mecca if they can do it. When you live thousands of miles away and you don't have any money, makes it hard. Some people still do it, and other people, they're not. They make exceptions because if someone can afford it, then they don't have to do it. This is what worship in Mecca looks like. I know the picture's blurry, but you have basically thousands of people bowing down and worshiping in front of this kind of central mosque, the Kaaba. And let's talk a little bit about what Muslims believe in general. So the 5 pillars really helps you, and hopefully you saw in the 5 pillars that has some, you can see how Muhammad had heard about some Christian ideas and saw that those things were good ideas and kind of made a system that was similar, but of course, different as far as it's, what they believe. Now, Muslims in their theology, they believe that people are equal before God. And so when Islam goes to places like India, northern India and stuff, which is now Pakistan, a lot of people are like, wow, this is great because it's so much better than the caste system. And so there is kind of this Muslim theology that promotes more equality. Clearly, it's strongly monotheistic, so much so that they believe that the concept of the Trinity is just blasphemy. Muslims hate the Christian idea of the Trinity. To call Jesus God is just unthinkable. And the Christian idea that there is one God, but there are 3 persons is complicated to say the least. I certainly don't understand it all. But for Muslims, they just reject it outright as being blasphemous. There are no images in worship, so I've shown you pictures, and I probably shouldn't have, because Muslims would totally reject this idea of having pictures of Muhammad, right? It's very much anti-idolatry, which is what's going on here. There's a strong ethical code, the Sharia system of law. So you may have heard of Sharia law. This is not just penalizing people for committing adultery, even though that can happen. It can do things like, set interest rates for banks and stuff like that. And so what I want you to understand is, in Muslim societies, the idea of Islam and a submission to the will of Allah means, this influences every part of society. So it does influence how banks operate, and it does influence how marriages work, right? And the idea is that we should submit. And so it's not really up to individual choices and stuff like that. It's making society conform. and making society submit to the will of God. So that's a pretty different, view. So Sharia law affects almost all parts of life in a Muslim country, because of the idea of society submitting to the will of God. Islam also has a really strong unity of church and state, and I pointed this out, right? Muhammad, he was a religious leader that also began to lead a really what winds up being an empire. Once Muhammad, I think I'll show you a map in a second, but once Muhammad conquers, he controls Medina, and then he conquers Mecca, and then he basically takes over all of Arabia, because there's not much of Arabia that's other than those cities, other than desert. And so Arabia is taken over, and then Islam grows from there. And so their founder, Muhammad, is both an emperor and a conqueror, as well as their religious teacher. Okay, so what you start seeing is, obviously, there's a unity of church and state. I use church, a lot more generally, but religion and politics. And what you see is this position of a caliph. A caliph is I want you to write this in there by caliph. A caliph is the successor to Muhammad, the person who comes after him to lead Islam. That's what a caliph is. And so he leads it both politically and religiously. And this is, there are several generations of caliphs, and then there's some fighting over who should be caliphs and who should be the caliph and all the rest. Okay, so this is definitely, part of what we call Muslim theology. Muslims do believe in eternal judgment. They believe that God is not obligated to save. They have a very interesting view of God when it comes to salvation. It's basically God can do whatever he wants. We can put no impositions on God, no obligations on God. So if God wants to save someone, he will. God can save someone who's absolutely terrible and be like, okay, you're going to heaven. Other person, you're going to hell. And it really has nothing to do with what people do. And it has nothing to do with that doesn't necessarily have to do with faith or their faithfulness to God. Now, Muslims kind of hope that those things, will please God, and he will save them and not damn them to hell, because they believe in these things. They believe in heaven and hell. But they, even to this day, Muslims will pray for the salvation of Muhammad. So if Muhammad's not like a lock, right? If he's not like a slam dunk as far as being saved, then I think everybody's situation is a little more is fairly unstable, right? So that's kind of the way at least usually Muslims view God and salvation. And it just has to do with the fact that God is just way beyond us, and he does what he wants to, and we can't really influence him at all. Okay, I'm going to stop there for this video, and I know it's a lot of information, a lot of terms, so I want you to go back and make sure you know those terms, what Islam literally means, what Quran literally means, what the term caliph means, what the term Sharia means. I'm trying to think of anything else, what the term Muslim means, as well as the 5 pillars of Islam. So that's a lot of information in a 30-minute video. But anyway, there you go, and we will stop for now.